what rough beast it's our come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
Je dis ce que je pense et je vis comme je veux. Je gagne beaucoup d'argent, mais quand j'en avais peu, je n'étais pas plus malheureux. Oui, mais je n'étais pas plus heureux. Je suis comme ça pour moi, pas pour vous.
So I am so glad we're doing this again. Welcome to What Rough Beast.
Thank you, Virginia. I'm so excited to be here, and especially to talk about your recent article.
I'm in the Epstein files. Let's just face it. I don't know how to. I still haven't gotten over the moment. It's actually surprisingly upsetting.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Take me through it a little bit. Like, how did you actually find yourself in the files?
Suddenly, sometime late at night, realized that I might be in there because
What would even give you that thought?
well, Jeffrey Epstein was part of, and it turned out to be the sort of secret sponsor of this organization that I also was part of. It was a salon, styled itself as a salon for intellectuals, and I'll hasten to add pseudo-intellectuals. You can decide which one I'm in, right? We needed it was roughly 75 to 25, I would say. And, you can probably tell which direction it went in when you learn the names of some of the people. But Jeffrey Epstein sponsored this thing, and I was in it too. And there were a lot of email blasts from the head of it, a guy named John Brockman. And like a lot of old men, he did not know how to blind copy people. So the whole list of all of us, which often included people like Elon Musk, showed up for all of us. And so for 12 of the emails, I guess Epstein's JEE, whatever
Vacation.
it is, Epstein vacation, whatever it is, at gmail.com was copied on things that I was copied on. So they were email blasts. I'm not writing anything back and forth, but just it's something that brings me back to a time when I was both a client of Jeffrey Epstein and also a member of an organization that I was initially quite excited to be included in, with names like Ian McEwan and maybe even Elon Musk. And so that's what...
Take me back to that time period. Like, what time period are we talking about? Where were you in this? Sort of tell me about how you even came to be introduced to John Brockman and who John Brockman is, because there's probably a lot of people who don't know who he
don't
is.
know. So this article appeared in The Nerve, which is Carol Cadwalader's new media project. And I only say that because she was at The Guardian for a long time and has formed her own venture. And that is, in a way, part of the story here, because a lot of us found ourselves, it feels like, under the weight of certain institutions. For me, it was Harvard and also the New York Times, that were giving a lot of our identity to our lives, but also ultimately sort of sterilizing or creating a ceiling on what could be thought and said in ways that were confusing.
This is the early 2000s, right?
Yeah, this is the early 2000s.
Okay.
And so my version of this was that I was at the New York Times and I was getting divorced. And I was, my history, as we've talked about before, was that I got online, ludicrously early in both my life and the history of the internet. Sometime when I was 9 or 10, I dialed into a mainframe computer, something like 1978 or 79, headquartered at Dartmouth College. And it was, I know, and there was a chat room, as always, and there were you could play other video games. And you can imagine it was text only. In some cases, the conference I was a part of was called XYZ. To join it, because you could only use three character commands. It was JOI space for join. Couldn't use the N. XYZ. Wow. There's so much strange apparatus around that experience, but I was very into networked computing from an early age, not coding, although the person that started this thing was John Kemeny, one of the authors of BASIC. And so I knew elementary basic coding, but what I got into early on was internet culture. And just the code names in those days, all the Led Zeppelin kind of stuff, like damsels and steeds, and they're just this weird way of talking. And my name was Athena. You may remember me. Nothing better for a 10-year-old.
Right.
And A lot of the stuff actually that washed up on 4chan, but kind of ways of posturing that was similar to that. So because I'd gotten on so early, and then because I did a PhD at Harvard, and then because I had worked at the New York Times, I was sure that I had finally paid my dues. But I also noticed that there were people significantly, they were like Clay Shirky and Chris Anderson, who had big books on tech. And I know you were also in New York at the time in the kind of Silicon Alley days, right? Of like working on these things. Yeah. Um, and there was just this constant puzzle to me, which is like, why did they get big book contracts? And I seem to be hitting my head up against the wall. And I was especially in dire need of cash. I had a like new baby and was getting divorced and was leaving the New York Times. I had a big job at Yahoo News, but it was on contract and I wasn't sure how long that would last. I was working for Marissa Mayer. And there was also like, how did Marissa Mayer get where she was? I just would puzzle over it. And I would think like, not to be a like, I went to Harvard dick, but it was also like, I don't know how much you've done this, but I would go over my resume in my head and be like, what
I
did
have all my
do?
permission slips lined up. Like,
Yes.
what's wrong? Yeah.
Isn't this the time where I should be able to count on like a W-2 and a salary and some benefits and a 401k? And I honestly would sometimes think maybe I should have a postdoc or maybe there's something
Maybe
I
what I
did
need
wrong.
is more permission slips.
Maybe I need more permission slips. Exactly. Exactly. I thought I had I thought my mom had signed off on, yeah. So I, in desperation, picked up, and of course I bought all these guys' books too. So I pulled a Clay Shirky book off my bookshelf and looked at the acknowledgement section. And the acknowledgement said, and I owe it all to, I named this person I'd never heard of, John Brockman. And I was like, that's it. There's a back room there and they all know this person. And if I have that person, then he, who was their agent, could get me a big book contract. It was as simple as that. Yeah. And I thought like, oh, why didn't I think of that? It's all about the agent, because I had a very literary agent at the time who loved the English major in me. But I was like, it's time for me to jump the tracks and be just like a hardcore tech, single mom who's entrepreneurial and who's not relying on kind of calcified old networks in the humanities.
Right.
So I cold called him, and he said,
on the telephone?
On the telephone. Yeah, on the telephone.
How did you get his number?
I think, well, he's an agent. So
okay, so you just looked it up. Okay.
Yeah. And I looked at his client list and, my eyes popped out of my head, because why did he have Jack Dorsey and Jeff Bezos as clients? But also it was like the tech gods of my childhood. It was like Kevin Kelly, Marvin Minsky, people that Murray Gell-Mann, who discovered quarks. And I was like, don't mind if I do, maybe I can just take my seat among these people. I did notice that there was an alarming...
Among the Olympians, old Athena coming back
Yes.
from Mount Olympus.
That's it. Yeah. Athena, exactly. I was like, I belong up there. Up there. And I did notice that there was an alarming shortage of women, but I took that to mean, well, every place needs women. So this is a good opportunity for me that, they could bring in women and diversify their list. Interestingly, I don't know that I've written about this, but the women on the list were Naomi Wolf, the great thinker of our time, who is a nut job libertarian now, I guess libertarian, Trumpite. But at the time was some kind of feminist. And Carol Gilligan, who, I don't know if that name means anything to you. So I think her degree was or her field was sociology, but there's a little prefiguring of the divine feminine kind of thing. She was basically kind of the queen of women just think differently. And it was women just think differently, and women are more soft and they don't want to be ambitious and whatever. And it was kind of feminist because it carved out this space for women, but it was a little bit women are
segregationist.
People. It was a little what?
Segregationist.
A little segregationist, a little separate spheres, we're made to cook and whatever. And I know a lot of women liked it because it sort of argued that women in the workplace were trying to act like men or something. Anyway, I think there was something quite reassuring in retrospect. And so Carol Gilligan belonged there. And I think Lisa Randall now, and anyway, some other people showing up in the Epstein file. It doesn't quite matter, but I was sure that if I was like, I'm a pick me girl, basically like intellectual pick me,
Mm.
because I was like, I'm jockey, I am tacky. I was Athena. I'm just as like into D&D as the next like computer nerd, dandruff club person. And I can also bring that like, small like hint of wokery if
Mhm.
you're trying to get the sheen of like, and we have women.
Right.
So I went in to see John, and I think he was kind of surprised to see me there. Like it really
Mm.
now in retrospect. Yeah. And he tested me on the pick me stuff where he showed me his office on Fifth Avenue and it had been the Playboy Club.
Oh
And he
boy.
showed me where there were like whatever that S&M kind of apparatus that people have on walls. It was
Oh,
like,
like the restraints?
yes, yes. And it was just like, I feel like in retrospect, it was like, can you handle this or are you going to freak
Right.
out about it? And there was a ton of that now. And who
Mhm.
doesn't, what woman of the 90s like me doesn't love to be like, oh yeah, right. I love that stuff. Like there's nothing cooler than like some serious S&M materials or like the Playboy Club. That's so, excellently retro. And like, who doesn't love that? And so after like a little bit of kind of testing, which I don't want to get too granular, but I've heard this happens with men a lot too. Obviously, not every guy is like gonna go the child molesting pedophilic route, but there's this ring of men who like will tolerate it, and then ring of women who will tolerate slash enable it, and who kind of get off on being like, I'm cool with this. Like, I'm not like the other girls who would be prudish. I guess like that's why the pick me idea is so powerful because I think we've all been there.
It's a little bit of a hazing mechanism where it's a little bit like, are you going to be able to clear this bar
Yes.
in order it's really more of a like, are you gonna tattle on me
Yes.
if you see what all this is really about, or are you going to help us satiate our appetites?
That's it. Yeah. And I heard, of a really good friend of mine was at a major magazine, and one of the ultimate Me Too figures was a huge editor there. And he remembered he was like a young dad when he was working for this guy, and he would just ask everyone to go out for drinks after. And that's sort of where the men advance their careers. And he wasn't asked to, have sex with a teenager, but he was asked to sit by while this guy told raunchy stories. And that's it, right? And I'm sure the other guys didn't feel sullied by that, or at least had made the decision they didn't feel sullied by it. But this guy liked to wanted to go home to his wife and kids. And he was passed over for promotion after promotion. He just wasn't available in those moments. And that is a kind of Me Too harassment too. That is hostile workplace. That is like, those are like soft EEOC violations. And if the people who get promotions are not just the people who sleep with you, but the people who tolerate that you're sleeping with other people, it's just a mess. In any case, I hope you see where this is going. Brockman was getting money from Epstein all along. And a
Mm.
lot of Edge, which is the organization that was around his clients. So,
And wait, so when you went and
oh
met
yeah,
him, he was already receiving money from Epstein.
he
Of
was
course, you
already
didn't know who Epstein was, of course,
didn't
at this
know
point.
at all, definitely didn't know who Epstein was.
Did you and at some point he agreed to take you on as a client. And at that point, did you know about Edge? And at what point did he bring you into Edge?
So he started immediately showing me the kind of things that he could offer me as an agent. And,
Uh-huh.
one of the things is connections to publishers, of
Mhm.
course. And that one I understood. It's just that he wasn't naming the people in publishing that I knew from my background in the humanities. And he was naming people that I didn't really understand and naming people that publish. I'm trying to think of who in public book publishing is in the Epstein files, but it was just that whole other world of people
Mm.
that were like, I mean, winning Nobel and Booker prizes. Like, let's face
Mhm.
it, they were like in this higher level, but in that realm. And everyone listening is in some world where you're like, how do you get to the top of retail or
Mm.
banks? And so these were people at the very top, but there was a real you can't get there from here. And that was
Mhm.
true with the publishers that he offered me. So I was like, okay, if they publish these Nobel people, I've never heard of them, but maybe this is again part of this like back room thing where the room where it happens,
Mhm.
I guess I'm there. Then the second thing he offered me was access to billionaires. And that was real. He showed me pictures of what are the billionaire dinners, the images from which now show up all around Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was,
Did
as
he
I can remember,
say you can come to, quote, billionaire dinners?
he said, we have billionaire dinners. We have an event at TED. And another parenthetical, you're someone who's spoken at TED. Another vague promise was that I would get these huge speaking gigs if I went to work with him, that I'd get invited to these billionaire dinners and make connections with people who could fund my work. Now, this is not a concept in the humanities. It's a concept in the sciences, but no one is like, there's no Medicis around paying for poets. Like, let's just face it, right? So the Gates Foundation, you're right. Although, by the way,
we're gonna fund your study of obscure manuscript and like a
nobody's
book
doing
that
it.
12 people will read. Yeah.
Although, by the way, there's a crazy detail where Larry Summers' wife was the head of my department at Harvard. And she actually did get money for a poetry project. Or I think she got the collaboration of Woody Allen through Epstein. So the allure of this kind of money, when it's washing around in the system, when you feel like you're a chump because you're like, I've been making $80,000 a year. And, I've got that W-2 and I'm at the New York Times and I'm in the newspaper guild and and I've got my health insurance and I'm a good person. And then some friend of yours who happened to have gotten in pretty early with Twitter, Facebook, whatever, has an expense account. They're picking you up in Uber XLs and you're just like, they're two separate worlds. But that one feels so close to me. And it feels like if I just took a step into another place, I would be doing the same thing I love, but I would, be able to afford living in New York City. So, and I think
just a scene set for any listener who was not in New York in the mid to early aughts. And this was the time in New York where tech money started to actually show up in a big way in New York. And it was the time when platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Venmo, things like that started to actually make just churn out the money. And so it was really the first time that anybody in the city had seen that type of lifestyle show up and be a big presence in New York.
That's right.
And it started to change the dynamics of a lot of these other prestige industries that had dominated the city prior, including the literary sphere, which was really kind of like the ivory tower prior to that. So that's just a little bit of
That's
aside.
absolutely right. I mean, the one of the moments for me was I worked at Slate in the 90s and Slate was owned by Microsoft.
Yeah.
And we had
I have a Slate story for you.
Oh, really?
Totally other time, but
yeah. Oh gosh. We had a retreat at the Microsoft campus in Redmond, whatever. Everything about it, I could not believe. I just thought ink-stained wretches, we're going to sit here and make $40,000 a year and write about the things we care about. And all of a sudden it looked like Microsoft and Bill Gates and whatever were thinking there was some huge value in what we did. Right. Salon, meanwhile, did an IPO, which is insane. And everybody was vested. So there were people around me. I remember distinctly hearing the words IPO. Our company is going to IPO. Could not believe that was even, I didn't even really understand. What it meant, publicly traded website where people were publishing articles critical of the US government. Anyway. So,
and this is again scene setting coming off of the era of what we called multimedia.
Oh my God. Exactly.
That was supposed to be the future of media in general, was hypertext networked multimedia.
That's it.
And and Microsoft had expended a huge amount of money on building verticals within the company on owning publishing going forward, because they didn't want to just sell software. They wanted to sell all of the things that were showing up on your computer and on the packet media. And so there's a really great book. It might be out of print, but it's called I Sing the Body Electronic, not electric.
That's great.
But it is tracking how they put millions and millions of dollars into publishing a CD-ROM driven version of an encyclopedia and all these other things. Anyway, so this is the immediate next era where they're like, okay, well, packet media is over, so we have to buy Slate.
Yes, that's it. That totally. We have to buy Slate, and we will, I think, start Slate actually.
Yeah, they might have done. Yeah.
And they hired a lot of people from the New Republic. And, it's important to remember before social media, which made the creators of media into chumps who are like, you
Yes.
know, people making media just for giving free content to these like huge platforms. It wasn't considered a privilege. It was considered a job to write for
Yes.
media, not something you do in your spare time, not something you do for fame, but something you do in exchange for a paycheck. And it was considered that the people who made media were more trained. That
They
like
were actually trained.
they were actually trained. They were actually trained. They were professionals. Yeah,
Right.
they were trained at all.
Yeah.
And but not everybody could cash in. And
Yes.
I
No.
had missed, obviously wasn't at Salon for the IPO, and I wasn't like in an Uber XL all the time with like huge sushi meals. And I did end up going to work for Silicon Valley a bunch and had a taste of that. But it was just like these parallel universes. And I wanted to skip the tracks and be part of that other thing. I felt I had to. And I remember thinking, I need to get in the way of those billions because otherwise it just
The
only
train's
thing
going to
that,
go by without flattening you.
yeah, yes, right. Yes, yes. Somehow need to, I don't know what, I thought of it as like a spigot that I could get under
Yeah.
somehow. And John Brockman seemed to promise that. I was like, don't mind if I do with your billionaire dinners. Another ominous thing in that meeting at the former Playboy Club with John Brockman is that he had just had a baby and he sized up my body and like how well I had gotten back into shape. But he also knew that I had just had a baby. And he knew that I was in the middle of divorce. And he knew a bunch of things that were, I think, Epsteinish in
He had
like,
done like Oppo research on you before you ever showed up at the
I mean,
office?
what Oppo, hopefully it was like potential ally research,
yeah.
but maybe it was. Maybe it was. Maybe it was like bring her in house, or maybe it was trying to figure out how quiet I could be about this, or if I was going to be a nuisance. Because as is clear in the current Epstein files, Edge had no intention ever of really including women in the mix. They needed to have a sprinkling. There's an amazing exchange between Brockman and Epstein that came out a bit later where Epstein says, we can't have women. I can't believe you're doing DEI or diversity. This ruins all organizations. It needs to be all men, which is for the talk of Epstein's interest in girls, there's a countervailing, if not more powerful, contempt, absolute seething contempt for women. I mean, not just misogyny in some kind of general way, but like active, just like hatred for women that I think hints of it were in Larry Summers, a huge Edge person, when he said women can't do math, that there was plausible deniability for that. Like, oh, but women are just different. Carol Gilligan, different spheres. But we must wall women out of all these things. And they also kept cameras out of the conferences and Brockman said this to me in the other grooming thing to be sure I would enable Edge. He said, we don't invite women to these conferences. And
He told you up front.
yeah, because he's like, because then we don't bring cameras because then people would complain that we don't have women. And if you can imagine, yes.
He
And
said,
if
we
you can
don't let people bring cameras because then people would complain that we don't have women.
yes.
Wow.
And by the way, people of color, not even a glimmer in anybody's eye. It's amazing. I don't think that they had, they didn't have Black conservatives in it either. Like they didn't have Neil deGrasse Tyson, as far as I know, and they didn't have the linguist that writes for the Atlantic, who's conservative. They weren't trying. They were politically agnostic, but they were openly white supremacist. Right.
Yeah.
So they could have Noam Chomsky and Steve Bannon, or how you name your polls of political polls, as long as they were white men. You don't have to talk about patriarchy in some vague sense or microaggressions or anything. They were just like, this is all white men. And later I learned they had read and researched, and many of them written texts about how not just white men, but men of Ashkenazi descent were intellectually superior. They had a whole evolutionary psychological vision of why this is true. Literally, that Jews had evolved to be able to do accounting and do compound interest, and that made their brains better. As if evolution took place in a compressed period.
Talk about transactional.
Unbelievable. I know, unbelievable. But anyway, I just want to emphasize how okay with that I was and invite listeners to think about times that they were like, oh, I guess I'm working at Abercrombie and Fitch, and I guess they're going to have shirtless guys. And for some reason, the head of Abercrombie and Fitch, Mike Jeffries, is going on trips with young boys, but that's where I live. Or even my boss's girlfriend is 50 years younger than he is,
Right.
and like, that's just what it is. And I live in this awesome world of like transgressions and money. And I'm not going to judge that because that would be like some kind of frigid prude or whatever.
Right.
Or I guess this, like, my boss does a lot of cocaine or my boss does
Mhm.
whatever, but there's like all kinds of plausible deniability. So, or at least I thought there was. There were people that would have stayed away from Edge, I'm sure, but I wasn't one of them, apparently. So he signed me up with the promise that I could meet these billionaires. Interestingly, he also wanted me to introduce Marissa Mayer to some people in
Oh.
hopes of getting them money. And Brockman was a convincing intellectual himself who I think
Mhm.
was really interested in ideas. And another interesting thing about Brockman is he was enormously faithful to his wife, whom he
Mhm.
who worked with, and she was like, she's quite intellectual herself. So the idea that like not all these people were the like truly depraved person that did the drug they were also dealing, or abused people that they were also encouraging other people to abuse. And I don't think that I think the infrastructure in some ways is more horrifying
Yeah.
than even the individual instances of extraction. The airplanes, the things that shipped the girls around, all that stuff is part of something Brockman was responsible for. Also, for him, the whitewashing of this as an intellectual project or the ennobling of extraction as an intellectual project grounded in evolutionary psychology. The
I mean, that is the
dominant
whole Western project, right?
That's the whole Western project. That is the whole Western project. How can you make capitalism a set of moral principles, or at least
It's a
principles that
for a fundamental ontology. I mean, how can you make extraction a fundamental ontology?
will say
And
that you've sort of introduced me to this idea of the fundamental ontology? Like, tell me what you mean.
I mean, like, if you think about a way of knowing, a
Yeah.
way of being that is beyond a choice, right? So something that is innate and natural and beyond question.
Yeah.
Um, and so that is a fundamental ontology, and that's sort of like going back to Heidegger, like,
Yeah.
and the Western ontology, the Western version of this, is based on being
Mhm.
and the idea of an atomized individual as the fundamental way that humans exist, like the
Yep.
epistemology, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it becomes how we know what we know is we're seeing it through an individual's lens. It's an eye
Mhm.
versus another way of looking at it is in a relational way where you see it as I am because we are.
Yeah.
You start to see like things as a relational field rather than as an atomized individual. So
Yep.
this gets into a bigger conversation, but it's like all of these different ideologies that these folks buy into start in that place of saying each person is an atomized individual with instrumental logic toward its environment, and it
Mhm.
is always trying to optimize its own outcomes in that environment. And that leads us to way down the line things like eugenics, race science, and even seeing science as social Darwinism or survival of the fittest
Yes.
instead of seeing it as what do the all of these different relations between all of the not just the humans but the environment, the other species, what are they producing,
Yeah.
what's emerging from that.
Yes.
So it's wild to me that like one can be so embedded in that place of seeing things as like, only like an individual optimizes for its own survival and its own outcomes,
Yes.
that you destroy the entire world that you live.
Yes, that's it. That's right. And, you still hear all the time Scott Galloway or whoever just cite maxims of some of these ideas that have this God to rocks idea of like social hierarchies and high value men and that women date laterally and then up and down and
Well, and
whatever.
it's hierarchy in general. It's like when
Yeah.
you think of an organism as fit or unfit, if you're
Yes.
starting from the place of atomized ontology,
Yes.
then you're seeing that as the organism is fit within this static backdrop of an environment,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Versus seeing it as the emerging relations of all of these things that create an environment that is hospitable or inhospitable to life.
That's it. And
Like,
yeah, this is something Richard Rorty did, this wonderful recontextualization of fitness, where he said there's like an absolute contingency in what survives, right? So you actually can't say anything special about the thing that survives. You are the reason that Darwinism sounds so intellectually satisfying, vulgar Darwinism, is that it basically is this tautology: whatever survives, survives. You know,
and whatever survives is good.
well, that is when you start clapping stuff onto it. But we can all agree that whatever survives, survives. It's a tautology, right? But you can't say anything about the thing that actually survives. It's like if memes are genes as culture, are the memes that have survived and somehow more fit, more moral, more principled? No. Like philosophy can be a philosophy, a poem, whatever, can be ascendant at a given time for all kinds of contingent reasons. There's no
Well, and you
logic.
have to look at how it actually interacts with the things around it in order to know what it is doing, right?
That's it. Right, exactly. So like, does the marketplace of ideas produce the best ideas? Does the marketplace, like reproduction, produce the best people? Are we just getting better and better and better as life goes on? Doesn't really look like it, you know? And so Rory took fitness out of the equation, but they leaned so hard into fitness that by the fact of these guys, and this is Edge, by the fact of their existence, but mostly by the fact of their monopolies. So the fact that they were sitting on so much capital and had won Nobels, had won chaired chairs at Harvard, at MIT, at Ohio State, the fact that they were running the wrestling program at Ohio State, say, and were capable of abusing thousands of boys. So this is just Ohio State. But in the Harvard evolutionary psychology department, so the program for evolutionary dynamics, PED, like pedo almost, they were making the case, and all of these people at PED, all of the people were A, sponsored by Epstein, B, clients of Brockman, C, members of this organization, Edge, that was supposedly this salon. It was sort of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, a place where we would promote each other's work or be assumed to. He'd make introductions, and then they would have these conferences to which I wasn't invited, fly people to TED, just stand around being great men together. And in particular, introduce billionaires to scientists, some of them in what I think are bullshit fields like evolutionary psychology, because billionaires love people that tell them being an apex predator and subjugating others is their birthright,
Right.
is what they have, what proof that they've won and that winning is good and that they're chosen in a Calvinist way that they suddenly map onto nature, right? But it becomes so much bullshit that it was the level of sophistry from them more than anything else, more than even the fact they had these much younger girlfriends or they had suspicious ways with women. I could not tolerate watching them publish book after book after book. The podcast we both admire, If Books Could Kill, treats David Brooks's book or Steven Pinker's book that were members of Edge. And they do a wonderful job. I could never reproduce it here, but of taking apart book by book by book. These things were sitting on the front table of Barnes & Noble, the homepage of Amazon. Yuval Harari, too, was a client. The books that Obama recommended, the books that everyone thought cited as the serious book, the book that you give your father. And those books over and over again stipulated that human nature was this who-whom dominator S&M relationship with weaker people, where strong people were chosen to dominate the weak, and that any discourse that cited relationships, language, culture as temporizing us or like having their own integrity was soft, was woke, was a drag, Nietzschean slave morality, drag on the overman, and was itself, that's where the bullshit was. They had a big thing of Nobel Prize winners are these particularly chosen people, and they're of disproportionately of Ashkenazi descent, which just mean that winning the Nobel is somehow genetically encoded in certain kinds of white men. Not Sephardic Jews, not Jews generally, but just Ashkenazi, so in a particular men of Jewish descent. So they're chosen in this particular way to win the Nobel Prize. At some point, I said, well, what about the Peace Prize, right? And what about there are other Nobel Prizes? There's literature or whatever. They were like, those are politicized. Those happen in the relational realm where you're going to give it to Obama or give it to Arafat, even though, whatever. But ours are for our special science where we've discovered.
Well, that's where it gets into fundamental ontology, because
That's
it's like
exactly.
it's outside of a empiric frame. You
Yes.
cannot question it because it is a fundamental. It is a given.
Right.
And that is even calling science that is like.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's exactly right. And EDGE even was founded in 1980 by Brockman, who wanted it to oppose, he wanted the tech and science to be this refined, old, Q-driven, numbers-driven, almost as holy as physics, that it would be driven by that kind of knowledge, and it would oppose the sleepy wisdom of the humanities, which was just like people saying platitudes about love or whatever he thought it was, daffodils, and that they would do this other thing that was not political. Now, I had come out of the humanities, so I was like, this is how people consolidate an ideology. And this is very clearly, of course, we paid attention to social Darwinism. There were social Darwinist novels that were trying to use this like law of the jungle dynamic. And it was considered like almost this folly to write ideological novels, right? It's like socialist realism. It's just like propaganda for. It's like Ayn Rand, right?
I know. I was thinking it's like Ayn Rand.
It's like not literature. It like lacks all subtlety.
No, but like she's the reason why we have the Silicon Valley culture that we have.
Absolutely. Right. But it turns out drawing bigger circles around Ayn Rand and problematizing it, ironizing it, making it part of a culture, using the tools of literary criticism wasn't exactly devastating to it. We're here like making our $40,000 as adjunct professors. And they're like, well, we'll be laughing all the way to the Ayn Rand bank while you tell us how important it is to read bell hooks.
Which in itself is saying that like getting a lot of money, an outsized amount of wealth, an outsized amount of mobile capital is the ultimate Calvinist judgment upon which thing is fit and which thing is unfit.
Yes, that's it. And you could, all this amoral and far worse behavior that amazingly, every time I would try in this, writing this piece, which is about this eugenics project at EDGE. So the piece we're talking about that I slowly over time, as I was part of this, as I was excluded from parts of it, I just had a creepy feeling. I had a creepy feeling with the books people were writing, and I had a creepy feeling with the way that I was shown the pictures of the billionaires' dinners and was like, that's where David Brooks spends his time. Sam Harris was another one that got into my field of view. And I was like, Sam Harris spends a lot of time defending atheism by telling you how bad Muslims are. This does not sound like a scientist. He's like trained in neuroscience. And a lot of people in this organization, including Brett Weinstein, seem to be anti-science. To me, they don't like vaccines. They were also, everyone was dominating all these prizes, including the Templeton Prize. It just seemed like I was like Serpico or something, like one of those whistleblowers that's like, everyone is committing crimes.
Right.
All I cared about, though, was the sophistry, because I was home with my kid and whatever. And I just thought, well, they date whoever and maybe they go out and like smoke some cigars and go to a strip club. What is astonishing is how this worldview, they took it home, and how many of them were, like Rupert Sheldrake and Mark Hauser, committing intellectual fraud with non-replicable, the replicability crisis, where so many, Dan Ariely, people can read about this anywhere, but, a huge chunk of the scientists would have these
fabricated data.
And they would give TED Talks, and no one could reproduce their research, but it had already become a meme. And people had already decided, thinking fast, thinking slow. Daniel Kahneman, who was a big hero of EDGE, also had this problem. Like every kind of neato thing that people would say at parties, just like women date this way and men date that way. And men are intrinsically, whatever it's called, polyamorous, and women are monogamous, and whatever it was. All these men are like, all the women be shopping, right? All the like things that like could be a Chris Rock gag, but actually were somehow dignified as intellectual projects.
Well, it's determinism of any stripe, really.
Determinism of any stripe. That's it. Exactly. And this comes up all the time now, still.
Yeah.
Everywhere you look, it still inflects what's considered what passes for intellectual life on the podcasts. It's just so head-smackingly ridiculous, and yet you have to hear it all the time. People taking testosterone like RFK Jr. and saying that they're invested in science and really just like flexing in this like absurdly transparent way. But okay, so they were doing all this sophistry, but what was also crazy is that almost to a one, they were falsifying data. So I was like, they're not even doing good science. Not that I know anything about science, but they don't look like physicists to me. They don't seem like Einstein. They don't like, I don't know what the paradigm is. I know they're not reading bell hooks. They're not reading Richard Rorty. They're not reading David Graeber. They're not reading James Baldwin. They don't have like things that I think are ideas. They're not reading. They do seem to be shooting from the hip a lot about women be shopping. That's what that sounds like. They don't seem like intellectuals. I just don't picture them with giant libraries going back to the work of John Locke. I don't think they're reading poems. I don't think they're acting like Newton and whatever. So that was one part of it. And then the other thing is, it is crazy how many of them have been disgraced by revelations that they committed sexual abuse, assault, harassment,
Right.
and so on. Just choose someone out of a hat that we've spent so long thinking. John Searle is one of my favorite examples, but Sam Harris, you name it. It's probably someone who is a hero to our listeners. I mean, it was very hard to avoid any of these people. But John Searle, inventor of the Chinese room theory, which I have my own problems with, but everybody cites as an AI refutation or whatever it is. I'm not even going to go into it here. John Searle, I saw him at a conference with someone actually 50 years his junior who did not speak English, who he had just brought from Germany. He had insisted, this conference in Oslo, he had insisted on flying her first class, which he was the only person that was able to bring someone else on their dime. I talked to her. She seemed scared to me. She was emaciated. She looked trafficked to me. And yet, I didn't really know what trafficked was, and I didn't really know how to talk to her. And I tried to talk to her sort of about her work. She spoke Korean. She had anyway, it wasn't easy to chat her up. I felt like she was not being treated as a subject at this conference. And sure enough, and I should say, I did make some calls, and
Right.
she herself said she was there willingly and consensually. Yeah. Shortly after, Joanna Ung, who was a student of John Searle's at Berkeley, accused him of sexual harassment and assault, in particular to Asian women. And it turned out he had a whole history of this. And the Searle Center at Cal lost his name. He was fired and stripped of his emeritus status, but not before he didn't sit on the whole field of AI for 50 years. And he was like doing this while I also wanted to be an intellectual subject, while I also wanted to have agency to do this thing. And I was just like pissed. And each one of them, I mean, not each one of them, not every single one of them. Frank Wilczek is a wonderful Nobel Prize winner. I think he had no idea really what was going on there. I think he probably didn't know Epstein sponsored the whole thing. And I don't want to smear everyone that was part of it, but it's an astonishing number of people who've now been removed from their positions. Larry Summers, obviously, David Galerter. But before this latest tranche of Epstein files. So not only were they devising this worldview that did, by the way, come down to an actual eugenics project.
Yeah.
Epstein was trying to seed a master race with his DNA, but they were also making lives hell for so many young women. And these are women also with their own intellectual ambitions. And that is just, to me, crushing. I mean, I remember talking to this young Korean woman about a project she was doing on the relationship between fear and anxiety. That was she spoke German. We were trying to, piece together a conversation. And I just thought, she probably tells herself what I tell myself, which would be, John Searle is interested in me because I have good ideas.
Right.
And that is the crushing part to me, is like hearing who the victims could have been, who they wanted to be, how they saw themselves, and how they thought, a professor is interested in me for my ideas. And then he was literally raping them,
And I think, as women who have, whether it's been in, academia, in tech, in any of these sort of like fields where sexuality and gender and power and the life of the mind sort of start to collide, I'm sure most people who have been there for any time have had a moment where that disappointment really dawns on
Yes.
you,
Yes.
because that has happened to me multiple times
Yep.
too,
Same.
where I think that I am being offered a hand, and this happened, fairly frequently in my 20s and early 30s, especially, but where you think you're being offered a hand because somebody sees your ideas, someone sees what you're trying to do, someone sees what you're trying to become, and wants to, foster that and to help you out of their desire to see good ideas succeed in the world. And then it comes down to a crass, pass at you in a party or a reception,
Yep.
or come get a drink with me and my friends, and turns into trying to forcibly kiss you or grope you. It's shocking how often that actually happens, and
Yeah.
how, and it's even like, it's to the point where it's a trope in films like Legally Blonde, right?
Right.
It's
Yes.
turned into a Hollywood trope because it is that common. And
Yes.
yet we are still sitting here, and
Yeah.
it's still such an issue.
And some of the Epstein victims who started out with intellectual ambitions,
Mhm.
including Anushka DeGiorgio, she was like into Oxford, and Ghislaine Maxwell groomed her by touting the fact that she was through Oxford, and like they were both intellectuals together, only to reduce her to an object. Probably every woman listening understands this transition where you experience yourself as infinitely galactically interested in the world. And then you are indistinguishable from other women of your age. Like you're somehow suddenly about your breasts. Like, I don't know that anyone who hasn't been treated that way could understand what a like bizarre, I mean, it is the primary inhumanity of
The
slavery.
humiliation and deflation that happens in that moment
Yeah.
is like, yeah, it's crushing. I mean,
Yeah.
it is. It's utterly crushing. And it's like, I think obviously there's probably young men who have interacted with Peter Thiel who might have felt the same way, but it's
That's
usually a thing that happens
absolutely right.
to
And
women.
yeah, I think when men try to understand this, so let's say there was a cognitive science department at Dartmouth that became revealed as a literally rape ring. That's what they call it in the,
Mhm.
and it was something like 5 Dartmouth students who had been raped and passed around at an Ivy League college in this cognitive science department. And I was especially interested in what the work of the men was on, what this
Mhm.
their cognitive science, some other psychological, some other social science term was involved in whatever they were studying. But they were studying like why anorexic women are particularly attractive to men. They were
Oh,
like
interesting. I remember that
thematizing
study. Yeah.
in their work, stuff like that.
Mhm.
And so and then they were preying on women who were also interested in like diet and emaciation or whatever, up and down, suffusing a system to facilitate something as brutal as like a rape ring. I've lost my train of thought on that, but I mean, maybe I should just leave it there. Like, it's just speechless. I hope that this system.
How did you get out? How did you leave? Maybe we
Okay.
should talk about
Oh,
that.
and by the way, to close that loop, it's the male Dartmouth students there who are also getting deprived of their opportunity for an education, for accomplishment, whatever. And when I talk to men who are like feel that they're just coming into consciousness about this, I think they're already quite conscious of it. That,
Mhm.
there's no time that the boss is doing these things that you are also not a victim or groomed to enable or those things too. So rather than just sympathy for the victims, because the victims, at least in the Epstein case, now have a platform. But what do you do with the enablers, the people who didn't get jobs, and often they're men? Right? Who are still like, oh, my whole life was disfigured by the fact that John Searle, I did not get to be the philosopher I wanted to be because I also thought something sketchy was going on. I also know that I was left out of a lot of things where they were passing around girls, or left out because I was gay, or left out because I might have seemed too woke, or it's like patriarchy's bad for all of us. So rather than be like, sucks to be a girl in the system, in the boys versus girls system, but I've done nothing but benefit from it. I really think interrogate your own experience and ask yourself as a man, Are you really where you wanted to be in your career? When you hear about like how financialization and how that screwed you, or you're not paying, you're under crippling debt, or think about that when you talk to the rape survivor. That's where you connect with her. Y- And then there, of course, there are men that are victims of sexual abuse. The people, everyone at Abercrombie and Fitch, and everyone who are Teal's proteges. Like, this isn't something, this is something that happened. The perpetrators are a tiny percentage of us. They monopolized our money, and the rest of us were screwed by this. Even those who voted for Trump, maybe especially. Like, you just had your minds colonized, yeah. Part of my interest in Edge is admitting that the upper middle class, the Ivy League class, we were susceptible, very susceptible. Like, if you thought that MIT was an impressive place to go to college, and then you also, it's not just Trumpites, it's not the uneducated. If this is systemic and this is a systems kind of thing, everybody is either in it or in bad faith about it, or, and there were limited ways to
Well, it's
operate.
water. I mean, it's
It's water.
water, to use the David Foster Wallace analogy, but
It's water.
you can't see it because we swim in it and
That's
we
it.
don't recognize it.
And one thing the Epstein files is doing is making it visible. It's
Yes.
like,
It's making the infrastructure actually visible
yes,
versus
yes.
just like the manifestation to where it breaks through the surface.
Right. And it is just like such a painful process to see the times. But, I sort of, Carol Cadwalader, I asked, the editor on the piece, like, because it's an English magazine. And I said, when you're looking through I want to list the names of people that made this impressive enough for me to join.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure in England who will be most impressive to your readers. So here's
Mhm.
the Edge list, and it is enormous. So you choose your people. And he chose Ian McEwan, right?
Mhm.
Because in England, and their readers might be like, anything Ian McEwan is a part of, I'm going to be a part of. And I sort of invite everyone to look at this list, because if you think you're immune, then like test yourself and see if you find any of those people impressive or not, or if you would have wanted to be part of them if you had been invited. Not because I want to excuse myself for getting involved in it, but more because, holy Hannah, they were
Well,
on top.
this is social engineering, and this is why social
Right.
engineering scams work.
Yes.
So it's because they take things that are credible and they take opportunities and dangle it in front of people that people need and want those opportunities. And this is exactly how the girls got drawn into this as well, in different capacities, depending on
Yes.
who they were, is that they were able to look like they were offering something legitimate. And
Yep.
then when you got inside, you realized, well, this is something I didn't sign up for.
Right.
But then at that point, the onus is on you to try to get yourself out. And
Yes.
that is where it gets very difficult, because the longer you stay, the more you might benefit from that, but
Yep.
the more complicit you are in it and the
Yep.
more damaged you are by it. And so
So
it sets up this really negative feedback.
you want to know how I got out, and I I feel like I've never been asked that question, but coming back to it, it's actually surprising how it happened. So there were 5 bidders on my book, Magic and
Mm,
Loss. And Brockman was supervising this auction. And, he had told me he could get a great deal. And the people who bid on it actually were people who liked my work. So they weren't actually these like
mm,
giant thinking I'd be the next Yuval Harari and I'd just written Sapiens and it was going to be on front tables. They were like kind of literary people, some of whom, were sort of like my type. And they were like
mhm,
at FSG or wherever. And they had like literary places, not at the places that make giant books. And the person who came in first and I went with was at a publisher that ultimately folded into Simon and Schuster and passed it off to someone else who was even more like a literary my type person.
mm.
And he said, "I wish Brockman weren't your agent because
Oh, wow.
he sort of sullies books like this. Please sign with someone else because I just get sketched out by him. I just don't
How
like it."
interesting.
And I was like, and this happened, and it's moving, that billions are not a good look right now,
Mhm,
Like Cuomo lost to Mamdani in part because he had the stink of billions on him. They didn't help him. And that's what Ben Lunan at Simon & Schuster told me, which is like, nobody's looking at your book and thinking like, Jeff Bezos is somewhere. in the edge of this. And that was amazing. It was like the aesthetic there. He had not helped me get a lot of money, for one, because the book was the book and it wasn't going to be Sapiens. And he also had hurt me with the people I cared about, the people whose opinion actually meant something to me. Soon after, I took Ben's advice and signed with another agent and have worked with her ever since. And it's just like, I can talk to her. She doesn't work in the former Playboy office. It just makes perfect sense. Like all the discontinuities of what I think is a collapsing system were gone. And there's so much to say for getting out of Uncanny Valley. It's like, you can breathe again. You're not like constantly trying to reconcile weird things. And that was incredibly liberating. And you don't have to sit for eugenics adjacent kind of philosophizing, and you don't feel like you're just alone and saying like,
you're leaving Dracula's castle.
That's right. Exactly. To like use your vampire piece.
Wandering around in the night being like, what if I sit in the wrong place? Am I going to get like exsanguinated?
Yes. Yes. Kind of a like, why don't you just try, working on a subject that interests you and not trying to optimize yourself to be Yuval Harari and writing the book you want to write. And don't try to write a book for a business audience. Why would you write a book for like, the books like The Tipping Point that double as marketing manuals or whatever that like look like intellectual projects, but they're really for marketing teams. And like, Virginia, just calm down.
I mean, I think this gets back to like, what is marketed as success? What are the things that you're surrounded by? And like, again, in that time period, it was like, well, here are all these people riding this wave. Like success is tons of money. Success is the, people around you looking up to you. Success is being able to pull out your expense account credit card, put everybody's meal on your credit card at the end of the night.
Right.
Like there were so many things that were baked in that are still baked into our culture that are very much about social Darwinism.
Yes.
And so it's like, well, I don't want to be unfit.
Yes.
I don't want to be pushed out. I don't want to be forgotten. Like I've worked so hard. Why can I not have mine too? And that is the type of mentality that starts you down the road of not thinking relationally anymore.
That's right. Also, people being selected not for the billions is really interesting. Like maybe you do feel like you're on the quote right side of history. And one way to see,
and it's fine to fall off the other side of history too. It's fine to be in the dustbin of history.
Right. That's fine. Right. Exactly.
Let's hear where the best people are.
Yes. However, I was also thinking from the point of view of even from the point in their own terms, if you were just like watching us as naked apes walk around in the world and you thought like, what's the robust life here? Look at Jeffrey Epstein, right? Dying in prison before you reach the age of 70 or whatever. I don't know how old he was, but it looks pretty bad. Like that's not a life. That's not a robust life well lived. And
even just looking at outcomes, right? That's ultimate outcomes. It's like if you look at it as a process, like it's miserable too, because it's like to use the vampire metaphor, and I know that was my recent thing, but it's like
I love it.
You're existing from feeding to feeding.
Yes.
You're existing in no space and in no time. You are not placed. You are not selfed. The only thing you are doing is gratifying appetite. And that's what these types of ideologies resolve to. And they also resolve to the inability to deal with any type of difference, any type of interior state of discomfort. You immediately must like engineer the external environment to keep yourself in homeostasis emotionally. And it's like, that is suicidal.
Yes. There was some time when I was looking at Jack Dorsey's meditative practices or something, and I just had the like, why don't you just try like chilling? You don't have to sit for 8 hours in silence for 2 weeks or whatever, 8 hours a day in silence with flies eating you up for 2 weeks a year and then go back to running Twitter. Like, surely the problem is like, just like undo all this. Like, I think Twitter might be the problem here. Like, if you're just like amass capital all the time and then I have to take ketamine to make sense of it all.
And that's how the ideology actually eats the person who even ascribes to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that became clear. And it also became clear when I started working with Ben at Simon & Schuster that like this life just looks a lot better. There's just, and you read those emails and you're just like, this is no way to live. I'm not like even looking into, the most like robust, healthy, they're having parties, they're like giving some money to charity. Like it's not there's no fantasy here. And Prince Andrew, like any one of these lives crack it open and it just looks like hell on earth.
Misery. It's utter misery.
Yeah.
And that's the real secret underneath all of it, is that it's miserable. And these people are utterly, utterly miserable.
That
And
is,
that is the thing they are trying to hide with this performance.
and that's now when all these lives have grounded out. So like Larry Summers, in the piece I call him the former economist. And my husband was like, "What's a former economist?" And I was like, literally, he was kicked out of the like Economists of the World organization. Like he's just not that anymore. And Noam Chomsky's obituary is wrecked now too. And every person in there, you know, Deepak Chopra's, like everything is squandered.
And this is why I will actually argue that a fundamental ontology that is based on atomism is unfit.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And
Because it is always going to produce an incredibly homogeneous and brittle system that is liable to collapse based on its own contradictions, and it is not fit for existing in a wider world that will create a resilient future.
I think that is right. And as we are going to explore when season 2 kicks off, there are things, there are more resilient systems, there are ways to live relationally that can take up the slack now that Edge has collapsed, now the Epstein class is collapsing, and those things are emergent right now. Is that fair to
Yes.
say?
It is fair. It is more than fair to say.
So I'm excited and I'm happy, more than happy to be done with Edge, more than happy to try to bring back some of the voices, including your own, that we haven't heard from while Sam Harris has been like squatting on the apps and the podcasts and the whatever, Scott Galloway. We've also just been deprived of all this language that could have enlivened the discourse. And instead, we've had this sterilized discourse, like driven by the idea that the rich are these apex predators and we all have to just be their victims to gobble up and suck our blood, you know? And now I hope that there will be greater biodiversity or greater diversity in the world of ideas. That's my real hope.
That would make us much more competitive. Maybe we would have a future.
Yes, maybe even have a
We'll
future.
see.
Maybe even have a future. Yep. Yeah. Thank you for letting me
Thank
talk
you.
all the way through it because
No,
obviously,
it's hearing from people who are actually there is really an important part of understanding what it's like to live through those things. Because when you're looking at things in retrospect and you're looking at things in a clinical sort of diagnostic way, it's difficult to understand like what could actually impel someone to get enmeshed in something like this. And so I
yeah.
think your story is important.
Thank you. So soon, we're going to be really talking about emergent new systems and the possibility of survival, which I
Yeah.
think is like a really and thriving and really like robust response to the really hard, fast dead end that huge sectors of our culture have hit. Thanks again, Sai.
Thank you, Virginia. Till next time.
Till next time. All right.
Yay.
This episode of What Rough Beast was brought to you by me, Virginia Heffernan, and Cy Cantarell. It was produced by Richard Stanislaw and Brianna Snyder. And John Jeremiah Sullivan recorded our theme song, Je dis ce que je pense et je vis comme je veux, which was originally written and recorded by the French pop star Antoine. Subscribe to the show at whatroughbeastpod.com or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Virginia Heffernan on behalf of the What Rough Beast team. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time on What Rough Beast. Wicked, we did it fast. All right. Okay, good.